You got a problem standing still, boy, or do you just not know how to follow a simple order? I have 17 years of following orders, officer, in places you've never heard of, doing things you couldn't imagine. Don't talk to me like I'm nothing. What kind of country asks a man to jump out of aircraft over enemy territory in total darkness to hold his breath underwater for 4 minutes while armed hostiles walk 6 feet above his head to carry a wounded brother on his back for 2 miles through hostile ground without ever stopping, and then makes that same man press his chest full of medals against the hood of his own truck at a gas station on a Tuesday afternoon while a cop who has been on the job for less than 3 years tells him to spread his feet? That is not a hypothetical question. That is exactly what happened, and every single second of it was caught on camera. Senior Chief Petty Officer Darius Cole was not doing anything wrong. He was not acting suspiciously. He was not making any gesture that a reasonable human being could interpret as threatening. He was standing at pump number 3 of the Green Mile BP station on the edge of Fayetteville, North Carolina, in his full Navy dress uniform, waiting for his tank to fill. The afternoon light was cutting low and amber across the canopy of the station and every decoration on his chest: the Navy Cross, the Bronze Star with Valor, the Purple Heart, the Distinguished Service Medal, and a row of additional ribbons and badges that together told the story of a life lived entirely in service to others, was catching that light and throwing it back into the world with a clarity that could not be missed by anyone who was actually looking. Officer Trent Doyle was not actually looking. Not at the medals, not at the rank insignia, not at the trident pin of naval special warfare that, to anyone with even a passing familiarity with the military, was the equivalent of a flashing sign that said, "This man has been places and done things most people never will." Doyle looked at Darius Cole and saw what he always saw when he pulled into this gas station for his afternoon coffee and his sandwich: a large black man standing at a pump in a neighborhood he had already decided certain people didn't belong in, and that was all the information he needed to reach for his door handle. He did not know that a 16-year-old named Jordan Hayes was sitting on the curb 20 feet away with a bag of chips and a phone that was about to change everything. He did not know that a Nigerian-American named Felix Okafor was watching from behind the counter of the attached convenience store with his hand pressed over his mouth and his camera already running. He did not know that a 60-year-old woman named Ruth McKenzie had stopped loading her minivan and was about to stand her ground in a gas station parking lot with a ferocity that would make grown men step back. He did not know that a reporter named Kira Okonkwo was 3 blocks away with a police scanner in her car, already moving toward the spike in dispatch traffic, already sensing that something important was about to happen. And he absolutely did not know that a sitting state senator was parked 40 feet away in a silver sedan, watching everything unfold, and that the choice that senator was about to make would end his political career before the leaves turned. What Trent Doyle did know, in the shallow and confident way that men like him know things, was that he had a badge and a uniform and back up a radio call away, and that had always been enough before. It was not going to be enough this time. The next few minutes would end his career, bring down a senator, and force an entire nation to sit with one brutal and deeply uncomfortable question. What does this country actually think of the men who bleed for it? By the time the sky over Fort Bragg had barely begun to lighten from black to the deep bruised purple that comes just ahead of dawn, Darius Cole had already completed 4 of his 6 miles and was not even breathing hard. The air at that hour carried a particular coldness that had nothing to do with the season. It was the kind of cold that felt intentional, the kind that came looking for you, specifically that found the gap between your collar and your jaw and settled there with something close to satisfaction. The road along the eastern edge of the base was empty in the way that only military installations are empty before the sun has any real business being up all flat asphalt and distant tree line, and the particular silence of a place built around discipline. Darius ran because he needed to, not in the physical sense, though he needed that too, but in the deeper sense that the 6 miles before sunrise were the only sustained period in any given day when the noise of everything else went quiet. In those miles he was not a husband or a son or a statistic or a symbol or a senior chief, or the subject of anyone's expectations. He was a body moving through cool air, a heartbeat, a pair of lungs working in rhythm, a man who loved his country with the kind of stubborn and aching devotion that most people only feel for their children, and that he had somehow never lost, despite everything the years had shown him. He stopped near a drainage grate at the 4-mile marker, bent down without breaking stride, picked up a flattened aluminum can that someone had dropped on the path, tucked it into the small zip pocket at his waist, and kept running. He had not thought about doing it. His hand had simply moved. That kind of thing was so deep in him now that it operated below the level of decision. At 39 years old, Darius Cole had served in the United States Navy for 17 years, 12 of them as a SEAL assigned to SEAL Team 3 out of Coronado before his recent transfer to Joint Training Operations at Fort Bragg in North Carolina. He had completed 3 combat deployments, 2 in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq, and had participated in 4 classified operations that he would carry to his grave without ever speaking of them in public, though he thought about them often and in great detail, usually in the early morning miles when the noise was gone and the mind was most honest with itself. His dress uniform bore the Navy Cross, the Bronze Star with Valor, the Purple Heart, and the Distinguished Service Medal, along with a row of additional ribbons and qualification badges that to the trained eye told the story of a man who had placed himself between danger and the people he served more times than could reasonably be counted. He stood 6 feet 2 inches tall and was built like something carved rather than grown, with close-cropped hair that carried just the first faint dusting of gray at the temples, a detail his mother Loretta Cole liked to point out with a mixture of pride and sorrow every single time she saw him. "That's wisdom showing up, baby," she would say, touching his face with both hands the way she had when he was 7 years old and scared of a thunderstorm. "That's the weight of everything you've carried finally deciding to make itself visible." Loretta Cole was a retired schoolteacher from Memphis, Tennessee, who had raised Darius alone after his father, a postal worker named Gerald Cole, died of a heart attack when Darius was 11. She had worked 2 jobs through most of his adolescence without complaining about either of them, had driven him to every single swim practice, regardless of the weather, and had sat in the absolute front row of his BUD/S graduation ceremony in Coronado, California, with tears running freely down her face and one hand pressed flat against her sternum like she was physically holding her heart inside her chest. When Darius had walked toward her afterward in his uniform, she had grabbed both of his hands and looked at him for a long time without saying anything, which was unusual for Loretta Cole, who always had something to say. The morning of the incident, Darius had driven out to Westbrook Middle School in Fayetteville for a speaking engagement, the kind of thing he did 3 or 4 times a year quietly, with no press and no cameras and no agenda beyond showing up in a classroom and being a real human being rather than a recruiting poster. He wore his dress uniform to these visits not out of any desire for attention, but because he had learned over years of doing it that children needed to see the uniform on an actual body, needed to understand in a physical and concrete way that it was something a person could grow into, that it was not a costume or a symbol reserved for other people's children. The visit at Westbrook had gone the way these visits usually went. Some kids in the back paying less attention than they should have, some kids in the front paying more attention than they let on. And then a 12-year-old named Caleb, who raised his hand near the end and asked with an expression of complete and genuine seriousness whether Navy SEALs were afraid of sharks. Darius had crouched down to Caleb's eye level, maintaining the same expression of complete and genuine seriousness, and said that the sharks were, in his experience, considerably more afraid of them. The room had erupted in the particular loud and unself-conscious laughter of middle schoolers encountering a joke they had not seen coming, and Darius had felt something loosen in his chest that he had not realized had been tight. He was driving back to base 40 minutes out, thinking about nothing in particular, the debrief he had scheduled for Thursday, whether Loretta had gotten the package he sent for her birthday, a technical flaw he had noticed in last week's water extraction exercise when the low fuel light blinked on. He pulled off the highway at the next exit and followed the road to the Green Mile BP station at the intersection of 2 quiet roads on the edge of the city. A normal errand on a normal afternoon for a man in a uniform that represented 17 years of the abnormal. The Green Mile BP station had 4 pumps under a broad canopy, a small convenience store attached on the right side, and a hand-painted sign advertising boiled peanuts that had been faded by sun and weather for so long that you had to already know what it said to read it. The afternoon light was falling at that particular angle that happens in the late hours before evening, where everything catches a warm edge and shadows go long, and the world looks for a moment like it is trying to be beautiful before the day ends. The air smelled of hot asphalt and engine exhaust and the vague sweetness of whatever was warming on the roller grill inside the store, and somewhere behind the building a crow was objecting loudly to something no one else could see. Jordan Hayes, 16 years old, sat on the concrete curb near the air pump, with a bag of barbecue chips balanced on his knee and his phone in his hand, doing the particular kind of nothing that teenagers do when they are between activities and not in any hurry to get to the next one. Jordan was the son of Airman First Class Devin Hayes, a crew chief and aircraft mechanic stationed at Fort Bragg, and he had grown up around military families, around the particular language and culture of people who understood what the insignia on a uniform meant. He knew what a trident pin signified. He knew what the Navy Cross represented. These were not abstractions to him. Ruth McKenzie, 60 years old, in a wide-brimmed sun hat that she wore from April through October, without exception, was loading the last of her grocery bags into the back of her silver minivan at the pump beside the entrance, moving with the unhurried efficiency of a woman who had been managing her own life with complete competence for decades and had no particular need for help from anyone. Felix Okafor stood behind the counter of the attached convenience store, checking his inventory against a clipboard. He was a naturalized American citizen who had come from Lagos 18 years ago on a student visa and had stayed, as he sometimes told his wife, because the country had a way of getting into you before you had decided whether you wanted it to or not. He could see pump number 3 clearly through the plate glass window. Darius pulled his black Ford F-150 to pump number 3, stepped out into the warm afternoon, and slid his card into the reader. The pump accepted it immediately, and the numbers began to climb on the display. He stood with his weight balanced comfortably on both feet and his hands loose at his sides, the way a man stands when he has nowhere urgent to be and is content for a moment to simply exist in a place without demanding anything from it. The security camera on the canopy overhead, the one pointed directly at pump 3, would later establish with its timestamp that exactly 63 seconds passed between the moment Darius stepped out of his truck and the moment he heard the door of the police cruiser open behind him. 63 seconds of a decorated Navy SEAL standing at a gas pump in full dress uniform with medals catching the afternoon light, doing absolutely nothing. Officer Trent Doyle of the Fayetteville Police Department was 26 years old and had been with the department for 2 years and 7 months. He was white average height with the kind of forgettable face that people describe differently every time they were asked to describe it. He had 2 minor complaints filed against him in his first year on the force, one for an aggressive stop of a Latino family on a Sunday morning, one for using unnecessarily rough language with a teenager during a routine curfew check. And neither complaint had resulted in any formal disciplinary action, which was not unusual and which was also precisely the problem. He had driven past the Green Mile station twice in the last several minutes, which the traffic cameras on the highway overpass would later confirm with timestamps. He had seen Darius pull in. He had watched him step out of the truck, and then he had circled the block and come back. He told himself later that it was the man's posture that concerned him. The security camera told a different story entirely. Doyle came from behind, moving across the concrete with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a man who had already decided how this was going to go before he had finished parking his cruiser, and he did not announce himself or state the reason for his approach or extend any of the standard professional courtesies that the situation did not yet require him to withhold. He just walked up behind a man who was standing at a gas pump and said sharply and without introduction, "Hey, stop, don't move." Darius Cole turned slowly and deliberately, not slowly in the way of a man who is confused or disoriented, but slowly in the way of a man whose entire nervous system has been trained over more than a decade to respond to unexpected stimuli without overreacting, whose reflexes are so completely under conscious command that even the instinctive act of turning at a sudden voice behind him becomes something careful and intentional. He turned, brought his eyes to the officer, and stood with his hands loose and completely visible at his sides. His face was neutral in the specific way that military bearing makes a face neutral, not blank, not empty, but composed, deliberate, present. "Good afternoon," he said. Doyle looked him up and down. His eyes moved from Darius's face to his chest, moving over the dress uniform, over the ribbons and the decorations over the rank insignia at his collar, over the gold trident pin of naval special warfare that sat above the left breast pocket, and the eyes moved without stopping, without registering, without the flicker of recognition that any person with even a basic familiarity with the military would have shown immediately upon seeing it. It was as if Doyle's gaze passed over all of that information, the same way it passed over the texture of the concrete beneath his feet. "ID. Let me see some ID. Step away from the vehicle." Darius did not step away from the vehicle. He looked at the officer with the measuring analytical calm of a man who has been trained to assess threats for a living, and he said quietly and without any particular emphasis, "May I ask what this is about?" "I said step away from the vehicle and show me some ID." "I am Senior Chief Petty Officer Darius Cole, United States Navy, currently assigned to Joint Training Operations at Fort Bragg. I stopped to get gas. I'd appreciate it if you could tell me what the issue is." Doyle's jaw tightened. His chin came up slightly. There was something in the way he repositioned his weight, something in the set of his shoulders that was less about authority than about the bruised sense of a man who has decided that any response other than immediate compliance is an affront to something he considers important. "Sir, I am not going to ask you again." Darius held his eyes and said nothing for a moment. Then, with a patience that must have cost him something to maintain, he said, "Then you're going to need to tell me why, because I haven't done anything wrong, and I'd like to understand the legal basis for what you're asking." Doyle reached for his radio. He turned partly away to speak into it, keeping Darius in his peripheral vision, his body language broadcasting the satisfaction of a man who has escalation available to him and is reaching for it. While Doyle was turned, Darius let his eyes move across the station, not dramatically, not in any way that would register as significant to the officer, until his gaze found Jordan Hayes still sitting on the curb with the chip bag and found the phone that was already in the teenager's hand. Jordan was already watching. He had been watching since Doyle got out of the cruiser. He was the son of a Fort Bragg crew chief, and he knew what a Navy SEAL trident looked like. And he was watching a police officer approach a man wearing one without having been called for anything, and something in his 16-year-old chest was already burning with a fury that had not yet found its words. His phone was in his hand. The camera app was one tap away. Darius gave him the smallest possible nod, almost nothing. A fractional tilt of the head in the direction of Doyle's cruiser, taking in the badge number on the door, the plate on the bumper, the timestamp on the world. It was so subtle that a person looking for it might have missed it. Jordan Hayes was not a person who was looking for subtle. He understood immediately. His thumb moved to the screen and he pressed record, holding the phone low against his knee, letting the wide angle take in the full scene, the cruiser, the pump, the officer, the man in the uniform with the medals, and the afternoon light falling across all of it like something that had been arranged by a force that wanted to make sure this was seen clearly. Doyle came back with the settled aggression of a man who has been reinforced by the arrival of backup in his radio. "Sir, I need you to step away from the vehicle and place your hands on the hood." And then, in a voice that dropped just low enough that Doyle clearly believed it was private, that nobody else's microphone was sensitive enough to catch it, that the words would disappear into the ambient noise of the gas station and leave no trace. Doyle leaned in slightly and said what he actually thought, the thing underneath all the procedural language, the thing that explained why he had circled the block and come back, why he had looked at the medals and kept walking, why 63 seconds of a man standing still had been enough to bring him out of his car. "Guys like you always want to make this complicated," he said almost conversationally. "Just makes it worse for yourself. You'd think by now you'd know how this works." Jordan Hayes' phone caught every word with crystalline clarity. Darius Cole placed his hands on the hood of his truck. He did not do it because he was legally required to. He did it because he had done the arithmetic that black men in America carry inside them like a second circulatory system, the calculation that runs constantly and silently alongside every other thought, the one that weighs dignity against survival and produces an answer that is never satisfying and always necessary. And the answer in that moment was, survive, now deal with dignity later, because later is only possible if now goes a certain way. His hands came down on the warm metal of the Ford's hood, and he stood with his weight forward, his back to Officer Trent Doyle, and he was very, very still. Any person who has trained seriously in close-quarters combat will tell you that there are two kinds of stillness, and they are nothing like each other. There is the stillness of surrender, which is loose and deflated, and has a particular quality of collapse in the shoulders. And there is the stillness of a man who could end the situation in 3 seconds and has decided consciously and deliberately, and at some cost to himself, not to. The second kind of stillness has a density to it, a contained quality like something under pressure. That was the stillness of Darius Cole at pump number 3 of the Green Mile BP station, with his chest metals pressing against the warm metal of his own truck hood while Trent Doyle stood behind him. The Navy Cross was pressed against the hood, the Bronze Star with Valor, the Purple Heart, all of it touching a gas station truck hood in the late afternoon light, while a cop who had been on the job for less than 3 years conducted a pat-down that Darius had not consented to and was not legally required to submit to running his hands along the dress uniform of a man who had spent 12 years doing things in the dark that kept people like Trent Doyle safe in their beds. Corporal Leon Reeves arrived in the second cruiser roughly 4 minutes into the detention, a 7-year veteran of the Fayetteville PD Compact and dark-eyed with the habit of taking in a scene all at once rather than in pieces. He parked, stepped out, and looked at the situation. He looked at the uniform. He looked at the medals. He looked at the trident. And something cold moved through him that he would spend a long time afterward trying to find a name for. He thought about saying something. He thought about it with enough specificity that he could later describe exactly what he had considered saying and why he had ultimately said nothing. He took a position 12 feet away and stood there. Officer Paula Grant arrived in a third cruiser, 28 years old, and in her first year out of field training, and she stayed close to her vehicle with the uncertain body language of someone who understood that something was wrong, but had not yet identified what the right thing to do was, and was therefore doing nothing, which was, as she would later write in an internal memorandum, not good enough, but at least it was the truth. Ruth McKenzie had set her last grocery bag back down on the asphalt. She was standing now with her arms at her sides, watching, and the expression on her face had moved past confusion and concern and arrived at something older and harder. "This is wrong," she said at a volume that carried. "This is wrong what you are doing." Doyle told her to stand back. She looked at him for a moment as if she were considering the request on its merits. "I will not stand back," she said. "That man is in full military uniform. What on earth is wrong with you?" Felix Okafor had come to the door of the convenience store. His clipboard was on the counter. His phone was in his hand and aimed through the glass, and his expression behind the lens was the expression of a man who has seen certain things in his life and knows with a certainty that does not require further analysis that he is seeing one of them again now. It was not until Doyle was running Darius's information through dispatch roughly 6 minutes into the detention, after the pat-down had already been conducted and backup had already arrived and the situation had already been established as the particular kind of unjustifiable that everyone present understood it to be, that he offered a reason for the stop. "You match the description of a suspect in a robbery that occurred on this block this morning," Doyle said, with the flat delivery of a man reciting something he has prepared. Darius was still leaning forward, hands flat on the hood of his truck, and he did not react to the statement physically in any way that was visible from the outside. But something shifted behind his eyes, a recognition that had nothing to do with surprise, because he had known from the moment Doyle walked up behind him at the pump that no legitimate reason was coming, and now the fabricated one had arrived, and he understood exactly what it was. While Doyle turned slightly to speak again into his radio, Darius shifted his eyes to Jordan Hayes on the curb, held the teenager's gaze for 2 seconds, and said quietly, barely above a murmur, just enough to be directional without being obvious, "Badge number, vehicle plate, write them down." Then he went completely silent. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He did not make any gesture that could be characterized as resistance or agitation. He stood with his hands on the hood of his truck, and he waited, and while he waited, he was doing the only thing available to him in that moment that counted as agency. He was making sure that everything Doyle was doing was documented completely and correctly, that nothing would be lost, that the record would be whole. Jordan Hayes, with the unhurried focus of a kid who has grown up around people who do difficult things without making a production of it, shifted his phone angle slightly to capture the badge number clearly. Then he pulled out a crumpled receipt from his jacket pocket and wrote down the plate with the pen he kept clipped there for homework he did on the bus, and tucked the receipt back in and went back to recording. Corporal Reeves heard the robbery claim, and something moved across his face, a flicker of something that was not quite surprise and was not quite shame, but lived in the neighborhood of both. He knew there had been no robbery call. He would have heard it. He had been on shift since 7 that morning, and he knew what had come through dispatch, and nothing had come through dispatch about any robbery on this block or anywhere near it, and Doyle knew that Reeves knew, and for a moment their eyes almost met and then didn't. Reeves said nothing. He would think about that moment for a very long time afterward. Ruth Mackenzie was still standing her ground near her minivan, watching with the focused intensity of a woman taking mental notes, her face having settled into an expression that her adult daughter would have recognized immediately as the one she got when she had decided that something was going to be addressed and was simply determining the most effective way to address it. Felix Okafor behind the glass had not moved. His phone was still up. The security camera on the canopy overhead was still running. The timestamp was still advancing second by second, capturing everything without opinion or bias in the unblinking and entirely democratic way that cameras capture things when they are working correctly and have not been manually disabled. The black government SUV came in off the road faster than the parking lot was really designed for, and the driver's door was already opening before the vehicle had finished stopping. The kind of arrival that communicates urgency without disorder. The specific efficiency of a person who has spent decades operating in situations where seconds are a resource and waste of them is a professional failure. Commander Raymond Vance of the United States Navy stepped out onto the Green Mile BP parking lot apron and took in the scene in approximately 1.5 seconds, which was all he needed. He was a stocky, silver-haired man from outside Boston who was 61 years old and had the kind of face that had been shaped over decades by difficult decisions, not hardened into coldness, but carved into something more specific than that. A face that had learned the difference between the things that required emotion and the things that required clarity, and had organized itself accordingly. His dress uniform carried the Silver Eagle insignia of a Navy commander. His voice when it came was the voice of a man who had given orders in active combat zones and was accustomed to being heard without raising it. The chain of events that brought him to this parking lot had taken less than 9 minutes and had involved 4 phone calls. Jordan Hayes, 16 years old and recording from the curb, had called his father Devin while maintaining his camera angle with one hand, a feat of adolescent dexterity that under different circumstances would have been impressive for different reasons. Devin Hayes, with hands that his wife would later describe as shaking badly enough that he had to dial twice, had found the Fort Bragg duty officer's number and made the call. The duty officer had reached Commander Vance at 4:17 p.m. while Vance was driving back from a logistics meeting at the base and had delivered the information in the clipped and essential language that military communications use when time matters. Vance had said nothing in response except location had received it and had made a U-turn in the next available break in traffic. Now he walked across the concrete of the Green Mile BP with the squared shoulders and absolute composure of a man who has coordinated extractions from active combat zones, and he moved without hurrying and without hesitating. And he came to a stop approximately 8 feet from Officer Trent Doyle, and he looked at him with eyes that contained no particular anger, which turned out to be more unsettling than anger would have been. Darius was still at the hood of his truck, hands flat, weight forward, the metals pressing against the warm metal when he heard the SUV pull in. He heard the door. He lifted his eyes and caught the movement in the angled chrome of the side mirror. He saw the shoes first, then the gate, and something shifted in his chest that he had not felt in months, the specific and particular shift that happens when you have been carrying something alone for a while and someone you trust walks into the room. He did not move. He did not say anything. He stayed exactly where he was. But something in the line of his shoulders changed by a fraction that Corporal Reeves, watching from 12 feet away, would later describe as the first moment in the entire incident where the man at the hood looked like he might actually be okay. Commander Vance looked at Trent Doyle, and then he said in a voice that was very quiet and very precise, "Officer, what is the legal basis for this detention?" Every person in the Green Mile BP station went still and silent to hear it. Doyle turned to face the commander and straightened slightly and reflexively, the way people straighten when they encounter a uniform with more authority than their own before whatever part of his brain managed self-interest could intervene. He began to say something. "Sir, this individual was..." and Vance did not let him finish. "This individual," Vance said, still in that same quiet and devastating register, "is Senior Chief Petty Officer Darius Cole, United States Navy holder of the Navy, Cross the Bronze Star with Valor the Purple Heart and the Distinguished Service Medal. He is currently assigned to Joint Training Operations under my direct command at Fort Bragg. He has more documented combat hours than you have days in this uniform." He paused, letting that settle in the air of the parking lot the way a stone settles when you drop it in still water. "I need you to tell me clearly and on the record with cameras running and witnesses present exactly what the legal basis for this detention is." The silence that followed was the loudest silence any of the people present had ever heard in a parking lot. Doyle opened his mouth. What came out first was nothing a brief vacancy where his response was supposed to be. Then, he was acting suspicious. He was pumping gas. "There was a report of a..." Doyle stopped, started again. "There was a robbery on this block this morning." "There was no robbery," Vance said, and pulled out his phone with the efficiency of a man who had already done the verification before arriving. "I have been on the phone with your department's dispatch for the last several minutes. There was no robbery call. There was no BOLO issued. There was no suspect description. There was nothing on that dispatch log that could be construed as a basis for approaching this officer and conducting a pat-down." He held Doyle's eyes. Nothing. What happened to Trent Doyle's face in the next 90 seconds was not a single event, but a sequence, each stage arriving before the one before it had finished processing. First, the blankness, the specific blankness of a person encountering a situation they had not adequately prepared for, the mental skipping of gears that produces a momentary absence of expression. Then the color rising from the collar of his uniform up through his neck and jaw, not the red of anger, but the mottled, uneven red of exposure. His eyes moved to Reeves, a quick and involuntary search for support from a colleague. And Reeves had taken 2 steps back and was studying the middle distance with the focused attention of a man who has decided to be somewhere else in every sense that is available to him short of physically leaving. Then Doyle looked at Jordan Hayes on the curb, still recording. He looked at Felix Okafor's phone pressed against the inside of the convenience store window. He looked at Ruth McKenzie, who was standing with her arms crossed and an expression that would have made a stronger man uncomfortable. He looked at Officer Grant, who had not moved from beside her cruiser and whose eyes, when he found them, told him nothing useful. And then he looked back at Commander Vance, and he understood in the particular way that people understand things when the understanding is coming from the outside in rather than the inside out, that he was surrounded. Not by people, but by record, by documentation, by the accumulated and irrefutable fact of what he had done and what he had said and what it meant preserved on 4 separate devices and a mounted security camera and a dispatch log that said exactly nothing about the robbery he had just claimed to exist. Doyle's breathing changed. It became shallower and slightly more rapid, and the shift was subtle enough that only the people closest to him could hear it, but it was there, and it was the sound of a man whose story had just run out of road. Reeves, in the statement he would file weeks later, described this moment as the one where he understood with a completeness that left no room for negotiation, that he had made a choice he could not take back, that he had arrived at this scene, assessed it correctly in the first 45 seconds, and had stood there anyway, and that the fact that he had stood there was itself a choice, and that choices of that kind do not get to pretend they are not choices simply because they were made through inaction rather than action. Commander Vance turned from Doyle and looked at Darius. Their eyes met across the space of the parking lot, and what passed between them, in that moment, existed in a register that required neither words nor explanation. The language of 2 men who have seen difficult things, who carry weight that most people never will, who understand each other in the way that shared experience creates understanding that is not available through any other means. There was grief in it, and respect, and something close to sorrow, and underneath all of that, the particular exhaustion of men who have been fighting battles that should have been won long ago. "You all right, Senior Chief?" Vance said. Darius Cole straightened up from the hood of his truck with the precision and deliberateness that military bearing makes into a second language, smoothed the front of his dress jacket with both hands, and adjusted the line of his decorations with a gesture so careful and so quiet and so public that every person watching it understood exactly what it meant. "Yes, sir," he said. "I'm all right." He was not entirely, and Vance knew it, and that knowledge settled between them like something that would take a long time to put down. Nobody at the Green Mile BP station knew, and nobody would know for several more days, who had been sitting in the silver sedan parked at the far end of the lot since before any of it began. State Senator Harlan Greer of North Carolina had pulled into the Green Mile BP to use the restroom before a campaign fundraiser in Fayetteville, the 3rd such event this week in a re-election season that his advisors kept telling him was closer than it should be. He was 63 years old, gray-haired and well-tailored, with the polished and practiced affect of a man who has spent 20 years learning exactly how much warmth to project in any given situation. His public identity was built substantially around his support for law enforcement. He had given speeches in church halls and county fairs and American Legion posts about the importance of backing the blue about officers being maligned by a media that manufactured grievances about the silent majority who understood that maintaining order required giving authority figures the benefit of the doubt. He had been sitting in his sedan waiting for his aide Meredith Dowd to return from inside the store when Doyle approached Darius at pump number 3. He had watched the entire thing from behind his tinted windshield. He had watched Doyle demand ID. He had watched Darius respond with patience and clarity. He had watched the pat-down. He had watched the metals press against the hood. He had watched Corporal Reeves arrive and stand 12 feet away and say nothing. He had watched Ruth McKenzie put her grocery bag down and stand her ground. He had watched Commander Vance arrive and dismantle Doyle's justification in less than 4 minutes. Meredith Dowd, returning to the passenger seat with 2 bottles of water, had looked at the scene and then at the senator and said, "Should we?" And Greer had said, "Let's just see how this plays out." He had watched it play out. And then he had started his car. He did not make it out of the Green Mile BP parking lot. Kira Okonkwo of the Carolina Tribune was 28 years old and Filipino-American and 5 feet 3 inches tall and afraid of almost nothing. She had been running a background story on patterns of racially motivated traffic stops in Cumberland County for the past 4 months, and she had a police scanner in her car, and she had been 6 blocks away when the dispatch traffic had spiked in the way it spikes when something is happening that involves multiple units converging on a single location. And she had driven toward it with the instinct of someone who had learned that instinct in this kind of work is not decoration. She had arrived in time to hear Commander Vance's confrontation with Doyle in its entirety, and she had her recorder running and had caught every word on audio. She had also spotted Senator Harlan Greer's silver sedan. Immediately, she had covered 3 of his campaign events in the past 2 months, and knew the vehicle, knew the staffer who drove it, and had written the plate down in her notebook, because she was the kind of reporter who wrote things down even when she did not yet know why they were going to matter. She stepped in front of his car as it began to move toward the exit. She had her recorder in one hand and her phone camera in the other. Greer's window came down 2 inches. "Senator Greer," she said, "did you observe this incident from beginning to end?" The pause that came back was long enough to be its own answer. "I think you'd better speak to the department directly." Senator, with respect, the department wasn't sitting in that parking lot for 15 minutes watching a decorated Navy SEAL get pressed against his own vehicle with no legal justification. You were, and you were about to drive away. Why? The window went back up, but by the time it did, there were 3 other phones pointed at the silver sedan from people who had drifted toward the commotion in the way people drift toward things they understand on some instinctive level they are supposed to witness. Jordan Hayes posted his video from the curb of the Green Mile BP before he had even stood up. No caption, no commentary, no context provided beyond what was visible. Just the footage running from the moment Doyle's first demand cut through the afternoon air to the moment Darius Cole straightened up from the hood of his truck and adjusted his decorations. The moment Doyle's hand pushed between Darius's shoulder blades to keep him in place. That was the moment. That was the 4 seconds that would change everything. By that evening, the video had crossed 400,000 views. By the following morning, it was on every major network in the country, and Jamal Thompson's name, Jordan. Jamal. It didn't matter. The networks got it wrong. For the first 12 hours was appearing on morning shows alongside his father Devin, who sat beside his son in a borrowed blazer and answered questions with the quiet and careful dignity of a man who was proud of his child and frightened for his child and trying hard not to show how much of both he was feeling. "I just knew it was wrong," Jordan said on camera to an anchor who was visibly struggling to maintain professional composure. You could see his medals. Everybody standing there could see them. "I don't understand how you look at all of that and still decide that man is the threat in the situation." Darius drove back to Fort Bragg after the situation at the Green Mile BP had resolved itself, after Vance had said what needed to be said, after Doyle had run out of words, after the small crowd of witnesses had dispersed back to their vehicles and their afternoons with the slightly dazed quality of people who have been adjacent to something significant and have not yet fully processed what it means. The drive took 40 minutes, and he made it in silence with the radio off and his hands on the wheel in the precise and deliberate way he always drove, which was the way of a person who does not waste movements. Back at the barracks, he changed out of his dress uniform. He did it slowly, unbuttoning the jacket with the same care he always gave it, removing each decoration and setting it where it belonged, hanging the jacket precisely on its hanger in the closet. He set the folded dress shirt on the chair beside his bunk. Then he sat on the edge of the mattress and looked at the wall. He sat there for a while. His phone was on the bunk beside him, and it had been vibrating with calls and messages since the video had apparently begun circulating, and he turned it off without checking what they were, which meant he did not know that one of the missed calls that evening was from the office of the Secretary of the Navy, and he would not know this until the following morning when Vance appeared in his doorway with the expression of a man delivering news that is both important and slightly absurd. He called his mother on the landline. Loretta Cole picked up on the second ring, which meant she had been near the phone, which meant that either she had been expecting a call from him around this time, or she had heard something already, and from the way she said baby, with that particular quality in her voice that she only got in the moments when she had been preparing herself for something, and the preparation had not been enough, Darius understood immediately that she had heard something. "Tell me," she said. He told her all of it, from the moment he heard the cruiser door to the moment Vance arrived, and the thing in his chest that had shifted when he recognized the gate and the shoes, to the moment he had placed his hands on the hood of his own truck and felt the metals touch the metal and made the decision to stay still and survive and deal with the rest of it later. He told it the way he had learned to tell difficult things without embellishment and without minimizing just the sequence of what happened in the order it happened, because that was the only way to carry hard things without them becoming heavier than they needed to be. When he finished, Loretta was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone with nothing to say, but the quiet of someone gathering the right words with the same care that her son had used in telling the story. "Kendrick," she started and then caught herself and said, "Darius, I need you to listen to me, and I need you to actually hear it. They could grab your arm. They could push you down. They could put you in a situation that no person with your record and your service and your life should ever have been put in. But they could not touch what matters. Not one medal, not one mission, not one moment of who you actually are. You understand what I'm telling you." Her voice broke slightly and rebuilt itself in real time, the way it always did when she was being stronger than she wanted to be for someone she loved. "I raised you to be unbreakable," she said, "and you were, even when you didn't have to be." Darius did not say anything for a long time. He just held the phone and listened to his mother breathe, which had been, since he was 7 years old and afraid of thunderstorms, one of the most reliable sounds in his world. "Come home soon," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. The Fayetteville Police Department placed Officer Trent Doyle on administrative leave with pay within hours of the video exceeding 200,000 views, which by the department's own internal accounts was considerably faster than such decisions were typically made, and which was itself a piece of information that the Carolina Tribune would note in its eventual reporting. Chief Raymond Buckley, a heavy man in his mid-50s who had spent 23 years with the department and was 4 months from a retirement. He had been quietly looking forward to for 2 years, held a press conference the following morning where he stood before a room full of cameras and delivered his statement in the careful language of a man who understood that every word he spoke was going to be weighed by people who did not have a sympathetic starting position. The department, Buckley said, had serious concerns about the stop. The officer's stated justification was inconsistent with dispatch records. A full and thorough investigation had been launched. A reporter from the Associated Press asked him directly, "Chief Buckley, did Officer Doyle fabricate the basis for this detention?" Buckley looked at the cameras for a long and considered moment. "The investigation will establish the facts," he said. The investigation established the facts in 4 days, which was fast because the facts turned out to be straightforward once someone actually went looking for them. There was no robbery call in the dispatch logs. There was no BOLO issued. There was no suspect description of any kind that could have been the basis for what Doyle described. The dispatch record for the relevant hours was, in the words of the IA investigator's report, entirely clear. Doyle's in-car camera, which he had reported to dispatch as experiencing a technical malfunction, was examined by department technicians who determined that it had been manually powered down approximately 6 minutes before Doyle pulled into the Green Mile BP station. Not malfunctioning, not failing, manually disabled. The distinction, as the investigator's report noted twice in the same paragraph, was not minor. The traffic camera on the highway overpass confirmed that Doyle's cruiser had passed the entrance of the Green Mile station twice before turning back with the timestamps 8 minutes apart. The Internal Affairs report, which Kira Okonkwo obtained through a records request that the department initially delayed and then fulfilled under legal pressure, concluded that Doyle had conducted a pretextual stop with no lawful basis, had subsequently fabricated a justification after the fact, and had intentionally disabled his recording equipment in advance of making the stop. The report also noted that this pattern was consistent with 2 prior complaints in his personnel file and 3 additional incidents that had not risen to formal grievance status but were documented in his record. Trent Doyle was terminated from the Fayetteville Police Department on a Thursday morning. The written notice was delivered to his home. His wife, Linda, a dental hygienist who had grown up in a military family and had spent 2 years quietly not saying things about her husband's career that she did not know how to say, accepted the notice at the front door with the expression of someone who had understood for a long time that a version of this morning was eventually coming and had not fully decided what she felt about its arrival. The Cumberland County District Attorney, a woman named Barbara Howell, who had been in office for 11 years and who made decisions slowly and announced them without drama, convened a grand jury within weeks. The grand jury returned an indictment. Trent Doyle was arraigned on a morning that was unremarkably gray and cold, charged with filing a false police report and interference with constitutional rights under color of law. He entered a plea of not guilty through his attorney, a local defense lawyer named Gary Pittman, who told the reporters outside the courthouse that his client had been made into a political symbol by a media environment that had already decided the outcome. Kira Okonkwo covered the arraignment and wrote a piece about it that won a North Carolina Press Association award the following spring. Corporal Leon Reeves submitted a formal written statement to the Fayetteville PD's Internal Affairs Division 17 days after the incident at the Green Mile BP station, and the statement ran to 4 pages in a handwriting that his supervising officer would later describe as unusually careful, as if each word had been chosen with a deliberateness that is not common in departmental paperwork. Reeves wrote that he had arrived at the scene of the detention, had assessed within 45 seconds that there was no legitimate legal basis for it, had identified the detained individual's rank and decorations correctly, had understood what those decorations represented, and had stood 12 feet away for the duration without saying a word or taking any action to intervene. He wrote that he was not able to claim that he had not known better because he had. He wrote that the knowledge was available to him, and he had used it only to understand what was wrong, not to do anything about what was wrong, and that this was a distinction he was going to need to live with. He resigned from the Fayetteville Police Department 11 days after filing the statement, not because he was required to, because the IA report had not recommended his termination, but because, as the handwritten letter he left on Chief Buckley's desk explained, he did not know how to be the kind of officer he wanted to be inside a structure where what happened at pump number 3 was possible and where he had responded to it the way he had, and that he needed to figure out who he was going to be somewhere else with some time and distance to do it properly. Leon Reeves moved back to San Antonio, where he had grown up, and enrolled in a graduate social work program the following spring. He has not spoken publicly about his resignation. Officer Paula Grant was placed in mandatory counseling and departmental retraining. She remained on the force. An internal memorandum she wrote as part of the counseling process, never intended for distribution, passed to Kira Okonkwo's inbox by an anonymous source. 3 months later, contained one passage that the Carolina Tribune published with her name redacted at her attorney's request. I keep seeing his face. The way he just stood there and held everything together while all of it was happening to him. I knew it was wrong, and I was scared, and that isn't a good enough reason, and I know it isn't, and I don't know yet what to do with that. Senator Harlan Greer's political difficulties began the same week the Carolina Tribune published Kira Okonkwo's story, which ran with a subheading that read, "State Senator Observed Incident. In full, said nothing, attempted to leave." The footage of his window going up, of the silence that answered questions that deserved answers, of his car edging toward the exit while 3 phones followed it. That footage played in loops on the political coverage programs that shaped opinion in the state, and it played without any narration because it did not require any. His primary challenger, a younger candidate named Patricia Orrin, who had spent 12 years as a public defender before entering politics, and who had been running 12 points behind. For most of the cycle began closing the gap almost immediately. The closing happened in the particular way that polling gaps close when a single moment clarifies something that voters have been almost thinking for a while, quickly, at first, then steadily, and then the gap was gone. Senator Greer lost his re-election bid on the first Tuesday of November, carrying a percentage of the vote that represented the worst performance of his political career. In his concession statement, he made no mention of the Green Mile BP station, or of Darius Cole, or of the afternoon he had chosen to watch and then to drive away. He said only that he was proud of his years of service and wished his successor the very best. Nobody in the room where he spoke appeared to believe him, and nobody who wrote about the concession the following day found anything in it worth preserving. Meredith Dowd, his aide, who had sat beside him in the silver sedan and asked whether they should intervene, and accepted his answer. resigned her position 9 days after the Carolina Tribune story ran, and was hired 4 months later as a communications director for a veterans advocacy organization based in Raleigh, a decision that she described in a brief social media post as overdue. Trent Doyle's trial began on a Thursday morning in early March when the courthouse steps were glazed with a thin membrane of overnight frost that had not fully melted by the time people began arriving to line the corridor outside the courtroom, which they did more than an hour before the doors opened. Veterans in unit caps and civilians in winter coats and a cluster of reporters with press credentials and paper coffee cups that steamed visibly in the cold air of the hallway. Not all of them could get seats inside. The ones who could not stood in the corridor and followed the proceedings through the murmur that filtered through the heavy wooden doors, which is a thing that people do when they understand that what is happening inside those doors belongs to them, even if they cannot be in the room for it. The light through the tall courtroom windows that morning was flat and wintry and precise. The kind of light that strips things down and shows them without the softening that warmer light provides, the kind that makes a room feel honest about what it is. Assistant District Attorney Renee Chambers had been trying civil rights cases for 9 years and had learned through hard experience that juries do not always return the verdict. Their emotions seem to point toward when the defendant is a police officer, and that emotion is a door that swings in 2 directions, and that the most reliable thing she could offer a jury in a case like this was not passion but structure. She built her case the way a skilled carpenter builds a load-bearing frame piece by piece, with nothing ornamental and everything essential. She gave the jury the dispatch logs, clean, complete nothing. No robbery call, no BOLO, no suspect description, no record of any kind that could have supported the justification Doyle had offered. She gave them the highway overpass footage, Doyle's cruiser passing the Green Mile entrance twice 8 minutes apart before turning back. She gave them the technical report on Doyle's in-car camera, manually disabled, not malfunctioning with a timestamp that placed the disabling 6 minutes before his arrival at the station. She let that distinction sit in the room without commentary, without emphasis, and watched the jury do the arithmetic themselves with the expression of people who are beginning to understand something they wish they did not have to understand. She put Felix Okafor on the stand in a dark jacket he had pressed carefully that morning, and Felix described what he had seen through the plate glass window of his store in measured and precise language, without editorializing, without reaching for drama, simply telling the sequence of events in the order they had occurred. And the jury listened to him with the particular attention that people give to witnesses who are clearly not performing. She put Ruth McKenzie in the witness box in her Sunday clothes, and Ruth held the arms of the chair as though steadying herself against something internal, and when she spoke, her voice carried the contained fury of a woman who has been waiting months for an authorized place to put something. "He was in full military uniform," she said. "He had more decorations on his chest than I have ever seen on a person in my life, and that officer treated him like he was nothing at all." The courtroom was very quiet after that. Commander Vance took the stand in his dress uniform and was asked to describe what he had found when he arrived at the Green Mile BP station on the afternoon in question. He described it in the flat and documented voice of a man accustomed to composing incident reports in conditions that do not allow for the luxury of personal feeling, listing what he had observed, what he had said, what the dispatch office had confirmed to him in the minutes before his arrival. He named Darius's decorations by their full official titles. He described the placement of Doyle's hand on Darius's shoulder blades. He described the expression on Doyle's face at the moment he turned and encountered the uniform of a superior officer. It was the absence of any grief in Vance's voice, the sense that grief had been placed somewhere far back and contained there through deliberate effort, that devastated the room most completely, because the containing of it was visible, and visible containment is always worse than what it contains. The defense tried 3 angles. Doyle's attorney argued genuine perceived threat. He argued jury pool contamination by media coverage. He put a use of force expert on the stand who worked through a framework that attempted to position Doyle's behavior as consistent with departmental training guidelines. Renee Chambers cross-examined the expert for 22 minutes without raising her voice once. She did not attack. She worked. She moved through the framework piece by piece with the unhurried efficiency of someone performing a procedure they have performed many times. And when she was finished, the framework had been taken apart so quietly and so completely that 3 jurors were looking at their notepads rather than at the witness, and the witness was looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone who has realized too late that they should have prepared differently. When Doyle himself testified a decision the defense made and would regret Chambers let him speak at length, let him build the version of events he had been constructing since the afternoon at the pump. And then she came to the podium and looked at him with the calm and level attention of a person who has all the time they need and said, "Mr. Doyle, you have testified that your in-car recording system experienced a technical failure on the afternoon in question." A pause. "Can you explain to the jury why the technical report prepared by your own department's technicians found that the system was manually powered down at a specific timestamp rather than failing?" Doyle said that he did not recall the specific process of the system shutting down. Chambers looked at him for a moment. "You also testified that you acted on a genuine safety concern when you approached Mr. Cole at the pump." Another pause, slightly longer. "Which specific safety behavior did Mr. Cole display in the 63 seconds between his exiting his vehicle and your exit from yours?" 63 seconds that are documented on the canopy camera with a timestamp that caused you to identify him as a threat rather than a man pumping gas. Isinu. Doyle said he had observed aggressive posture. Chambers set her pen down on the podium, very gently looked at him, and said in a voice that was completely conversational, "Mr. Doyle, at what point in your training were you taught that standing still at a gas pump constitutes aggressive posture?" There was no answer to that question that was going to be good enough, and everyone in the room understood it at the same moment, including Trent Doyle. Darius Cole did not testify. He had made that decision in a long conversation with his attorney, grounded in the conviction that the facts of the case did not require his voice to carry weight, that the dispatch logs and the camera footage and the technical report and the testimony of the people who had been standing in that parking lot were sufficient, and that adding his voice to the record would give the defense something to work with that the rest of the evidence did not give them. He sat in the gallery on the first day and on the last day wearing dark jeans and a plain jacket and nothing that announced his presence. He watched with the controlled and comprehensive attention he brought to everything. He did not look away. When the jury filed back into the courtroom after 4 hours and 11 minutes of deliberation, Trent Doyle sat at the defense table and looked at his hands. He had not looked at Darius Cole once in the 3 days of trial. He looked at his hands and at the table and at the particular vacant space that people look at when they have already understood what is coming and are trying to work out how to survive the moment of its arrival. The foreperson stood. The courtroom held its breath. Guilty on both counts, filing a false police report and interference with constitutional rights under color of law. The room did not erupt. There were no cheers, no theatrical outbursts, no moment of cathartic release of the kind that movies have trained people to expect. What happened instead was something quieter and more complete. A collective exhale, the sound of a large group of people releasing something that they had been holding in their bodies for months without fully realizing how much effort the holding had required. Someone near the back of the gallery was crying. A veteran in the third row pressed his fist against his mouth. 2 women in the far aisle reached for each other's hands. At sentencing, the presiding federal judge, a woman named the Honorable Constance Mara, who had been on the bench for 19 years and who was known among the attorneys who appeared before her for a particular quality of attention that made it impossible to be in her courtroom and not feel that every word mattered, addressed Trent Doyle directly in the considered and deliberate language of a person who understood the weight of what they were doing and was not going to rush through it. "You were given a badge and a firearm and authority over your fellow citizens," Judge Mara said, "and those things were given to you on the understanding that you would use them to protect people, all people equally, and without the filtering of your own prejudices. You chose instead to use the first 2 to express the third. And when the man you targeted turned out to be someone who had spent 17 years doing what most of us will never be asked to do, in places most of us will never see, you had every opportunity to stop to recognize your mistake and to do something different. You chose instead to fabricate a justification and to disable the equipment that would have recorded your choice. She looked at him for a long moment. Every time an officer raises a badge to hide a lie rather than to honor an oath, the badge itself loses something. And when the person they choose to hide that lie from is someone who has sacrificed as much as Senior Chief Cole has sacrificed, that is not merely a crime. That is a betrayal of something this country cannot afford to keep betraying. Doyle was sentenced to 14 months in federal custody, 3 years of supervised release, and a permanent bar from serving in any law enforcement capacity at any level. Darius sat in the gallery and heard the verdict and the sentence, and what he felt was not triumph, and it was not the clean and complete resolution he had sometimes imagined in the long months between the gas station and the courtroom. What he felt was more complicated and more honest than satisfaction, a grief that extended beyond himself and backward through time to every man and every woman who had stood where he stood in a parking lot, or on a street corner, or in a hallway without a video, without a commander who diverted on his way back from a meeting, without a teenager on a curb with the courage to press record. The ones who had not had those things. The ones whose names became nothing or became a case number or became a statistic in a report that nobody read. He felt them in the room with him in the particular and wordless way that shared experience creates connection across time, and he held that weight, and he did not set it down because he understood that the not setting it down was also part of what he owed. He carried it out of the courthouse into a pale spring afternoon where Commander Vance was at the curb with his truck idling and the engine warm. Vance looked at him without asking for a speech. "How do you feel?" he said. Darius stood for a moment in the thin sunlight and let the air move against his face. "Like it isn't over," he said. Vance thought about that, nodded slowly. "No," he said, "it ain't." They drove back toward the base, and the river ran alongside the highway for several miles, silver and steady and moving in the only direction it knew. Several months after the verdict, on a cold December morning when the sky was the particular flat gray that makes the world look like it is conserving itself, Darius Cole drove back to the Green Mile BP station on the edge of Fayetteville. He was not entirely sure why. The station had no prior meaning to him, no history before that afternoon, no associations he would have chosen. It was simply a gas station with 4 pumps and a faded sign about boiled peanuts. But he drove there anyway, and he pulled up to pump number 3, and he stood in the cold morning air while the numbers climbed on the display, and he went inside to pay cash. Felix Okafor was behind the counter. He had printed out the photograph, the one that had circulated more than any other, the one taken from Jordan Hayes' video at the moment Vance arrived, showing Darius standing at the hood of his truck with the metals catching the afternoon light and his posture carrying everything he had ever been, and he had mounted it in a simple black frame behind the register with a small square of paper taped beneath it in handwriting that was careful and slightly formal. "American hero, always welcome here." Darius stood at the counter and looked at himself, at that version of himself, the one in the full dress uniform, impossibly still holding everything together in a parking lot where nothing was required of him but to survive. And for a moment, he did not say anything at all. Felix watched him from behind the counter with the quiet and compassionate attention of a man who has thought about another person's pain many times and is now in the presence of it and knows not to fill the silence with noise. "That's a good man in that photograph," Felix said after a while. Darius looked at him. Something in his face shifted very slightly, the way a door that has been held shut for a long time shifts when someone finally stops holding it. "I appreciate that," he said. He paid for his gas and shook Felix's hand and drove back to the base through a winter morning that was cold and quiet and his. Jordan Hayes received a personal letter from Darius Cole 3 months after the verdict, handwritten 2 pages delivered to the Hayes family's quarters on Fort Bragg. In it, Darius told Jordan that courage does not require a trident or a rank or a history of doing difficult things in difficult places, and that what Jordan had done on that curb, standing up, pressing record, refusing to look away, Writing down a badge number on a crumpled receipt with a pen he kept for bus homework had mattered more than Jordan probably knew, and that the knowing of it mattered to Darius in a way that was hard to put into language, but that he was trying to put into it anyway, because Jordan deserved to have someone try. Jordan is now enrolled at North Carolina A&T studying journalism, and the professor who teaches his first media ethics course keeps a printed still from the original Green Mile video pinned to her office door with a handwritten note beneath it. This is why it matters. Darius Cole, in the year following his honorable discharge from the Navy at the age of 42, settled in Memphis close to Loretta and co-founded an organization with Commander Raymond Vance, who retired the following spring, called the Trident Foundation, which provides legal resources, counseling, and direct advocacy for military veterans who have faced discrimination or rights violations, because Darius understood that the only thing worse than what happened to him at pump number 3 was the knowledge that it had happened to others who had not had a teenager on a curb, a commander 4 minutes away, or a reporter 6 blocks out with a scanner in her car. Loretta Cole keeps a copy of Kira Okonkwo's Carolina Tribune profile on the coffee table in her living room in Memphis, and she has read it more times than she can count in the early mornings when she is proud, and in the late evenings when she is afraid in the way mothers are afraid when they understand exactly what the world is capable of, and in the in-between moments when she simply needs to be reminded that she raised someone who held himself together when everything around him was trying to tell him he wasn't worth the effort of holding. He always was. What happened at that gas station was one man's story, and it was also something much larger. A mirror held up to a country still deciding what it actually believes about the people it sends into the dark on its behalf. Darius Cole carried 17 years of sacrifice into a parking lot and was made to feel like a criminal. And he did not break, and he did not lower himself to the level of what was being done to him, and he trusted that the truth would do its work if there were eyes to see it. There were, because a 16-year-old kid on a curb with a half-eaten bag of chips had the courage to press record. If this story moved you, if it left something in you that wasn't there before, we want to know, would you have called it out, the way Ruth McKenzie did, bag still in hand, not one step back, or would you have waited? Uncertain, watching from the edges the way so many people did that afternoon. Tell us honestly in the comments, because those answers matter. Hit like, share this with someone who needs to see it, and if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, now is the time. Because this is what we do here. We tell the stories that make you feel awake and alive and responsible for something. We'll see you in the next one.